Michelle, you're all ready. I've spoken too much. You can work away.
Okay. Share my. Okay. Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm here to speak in my capacity as someone who detransitioned. I'm going to basically go through my life story and give a profile of one type of person that may pursue transition, someone who didn't experience any type of gender dysphoria until young adult years. Okay. In my childhood, I would have been considered a gender non-conforming person. So when I say that, I didn't like wearing dresses. I was doing tomboy activities, things that would be considered something a tomboy would do, physical activities outside, climbing trees, playing sports. When I was a little older, collecting Pokemon cards, playing video games. These are things that I mostly saw boys doing, not so much girls, and role playing as male characters. But psychologically, as a child, I also had a high need for control, which would mean I really wanted things to go my way. And if they didn't go my way, then I would get really upset. I just needed to be, it was very particular. And that leads into the next point, which is that I was very emotionally reactive. It was very easy to make me angry, very easy to get me to start crying, etc. And finally, the third point that I added is I had a lot of body focused repetitive behaviors. Now, those three ways that I've described myself, that's not how I would have described myself as a kid or how other people would have described me. They would have described me as bossy, or in a good situation, they might say I had leadership skills. And they also point out that the fact that I was so reactive, that's why I was getting bullied. But that's what it led into, essentially, is that those body focused repetitive behaviors were things like picking my nose, chewing my nails, licking my lips, etc. So having all those things together, it turns out that a lot of people don't really like a bossy kid with weird habits who's really easy to take off. So I became a target for bullying. And over those years, pretty much every single day, I was having these messages put into me that I'm gross and I'm ugly and nobody likes me. So, into adolescence, I started experiencing depression. I had very few friends. I was self harming when I was in my mid teen years, although the very first time I self harmed, I was 11. But also going on in adolescence was a little bit of exploration of gender. So, where I was a tomboy when I was younger, I was trying to explore traditional femininity, so wearing skirts and trying makeup. But even so, femininity felt really foreign to me. And also during these years, I was starting to date. I had relationships mainly with older men. A lot of the people my age didn't seem to like me, but I noticed that men who were older did seem to like me, which is unfortunate, actually. So my first relationship was with an 18-year-old man when I was 14. And the last relationship that I had in this time period was with someone 4 years older than me, but I was in my last year of high school. And that relationship was very bad. It was very emotionally abusive, very controlling. And in all of those relationships, I had very uncomfortable experiences with sex. So I was being coerced into doing things that I wasn't ready to do. And it just wasn't enjoyable for me at all. So that last relationship, we ended up breaking up in 2008. And after that point, I felt like I really needed to recapture my agency in this relationship where I'd been so controlled. So I moved in with my friends and lived in the city of Toronto. And one of the things I did immediately was more exploration of my own aesthetic and of gender expression. But I went in the opposite direction. So I went to more of what I was doing as a child, as a tomboy. So wearing men's clothing, I got interested in men's formal wear. I was cutting my hair short and eventually binding my breasts as well. And coinciding with this was I was finally getting into social media, especially Tumblr. And particularly, I was introduced to social justice activism. And that's the first time I heard about the idea of being transgender. So during that questioning period of time between 2008 2010, I was introduced to what trans meant and the idea of gender dysphoria. And I noticed that the way that people spoke about gender dysphoria on social media, they would often refer to really common experiences, sometimes even universal experiences, things like if you feel like you don't fit in, that's gender dysphoria. or things along those lines, where it felt like it could be something that could really be attributed to anything, but it was being specifically pointed to as being gender dysphoria. And I didn't have any other options. So even though I might have been bullied for many reasons as a child, to me, I thought, you know what, maybe because of all of these other reasons as well, I didn't fit in with girls, I didn't like makeup, I was obsessively thinking about my gender, maybe what the real answer is, this all happened because I'm trans. So that's sort of how the looking for proof started. There's the way that people talk about trans online is if you think you're trans, you are. There's very little of people telling you that you're not trans or that you should think about not transitioning. It's very encouraged to transition specifically. And the example I put there is amitransgender.net, because if you go to that website, what you get is the word yes in big letters. So that's one example of the influence in that regard. And a related thing that people would say often is that only a trans person would question their gender this much. So, of course, I was obsessively hyperfixated on this idea that I could be transgender. So I thought, this is even more proof. The fact that I'm thinking about it this much itself is proof. So I looked through my history and I thought, you know what? All of these reasons must be why I'm trans. And the more that I thought about it, I think I actually sort of created my own gender dysphoria throughout this, because before about 2008, I didn't want my breasts removed. But as I thought about it more and more, then I started to want them removed, and believe that it kickstarted it. I reframed my whole life thinking, I was trans this whole time. Now, this is a timeline that I made of my medical transition. So in 2010, I told my parents and my family and friends that I believed that I was a transgender man in about February of 2010. And in the summer of that year, I attended a support group for people who were thinking about transitioning. I got a lot of information in that group, but specifically, one of the therapists that ran the group, who's also trans, did about an hour meeting with me in which he wrote the letter recommending testosterone for me and referred me to a clinic. So that was how I got to a general practitioner. I didn't go to a gender identity clinic. I went to a general practitioner who prescribed testosterone for me in October of 2010. It was on my third appointment that they did that for me. And I went through the sort of a modified informed consent model. So I did require letters, the one from that one therapist recommending testosterone, and the other one was from my regular therapist who I was seeing for non-gender related reasons, who basically said that I was of sound mind to make that decision. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that therapist had never had a trans client before, so she wouldn't have known what to look for, I don't think. But at any rate, 14 months after that, in January of 2012, I had a bilateral mastectomy. And in 2016, I actually stopped taking testosterone. And the reason, interestingly, it's been brought up, one of the main reasons was acne. I'm still having acne 5 years down the road, and it was just terrible. So I wanted to stop. There were other things that sort of came into play. I wasn't interested in masculinizing my body anymore. It just wasn't a priority for me anymore. And another problem was that I was having issues with executive dysfunction, in that I was meant to take my shot every 2 weeks. And the day that I was supposed to take it would come, and then I just didn't want to do it. So I just pushed to the next day, and then the next day, and the next day. So I ended up taking shots every 3 weeks, and I thought, this is probably not good for me. So I stopped. And to coincide with that, I started identifying as non-binary instead of a trans man. And I continued to identify as transgender for another 5 years after that. The year following that, in 2017, I had a psychoeducational assessment because I was attending university and it wasn't going very well. And in that assessment, I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. I had other diagnoses as well, but ones that might be relevant are I had significant traits of post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder. What I find interesting is the psychologist who did this, she didn't question my gender at all. So she just took an affirming approach. My entire 25-page assessment is written with they, them pronouns, etc. But nowhere in there did she say, maybe something about this might make you reconsider your gender identity. Maybe one of these developmental disabilities had something to do with your gender. I feel like this is a missed opportunity for her to bring this up with me. But because she didn't, I continued on the pathway I was on. And I had a hysterectomy the following year. Because I had stopped taking testosterone, I kept my ovaries. 2 years after that, November 2020, is when I detransitioned. And I announced to my family last year in February. And the thing that made me stop, that I decided to detransition, was that now that I had the diagnoses, it took me many years to really look into autism and ADHD and think about them and how each of these things might have affected me. And I look back on it and think, how could you possibly have missed this? This is something that would have been so crucial to the decision that I was making to transition. And it was never offered to me. So this is my last slide. When I came to a form of understanding, and if I had had some type of gender exploratory therapy, this is what I would assume that it would look like, thinking about all of the possible other reasons that I didn't like makeup or dislike dresses. Like, those were sensory issues, actually. They had nothing to do with my gender. And then what you see on here is blue squares are the things that I think about before, and the orange squares are just new ideas that I had never thought of before. I transitioned, I think, as part of a coping mechanism. It was escapism. I was trying to get away from being female and the parts of it that I didn't like. And passing helped me with anxiety because I felt like there were less pressures on me. But actually, when I started identifying as non-binary, one of the reasons was because I realized that there are actually gendered pressures, expectations of men as well that I also didn't fit. So at the end of the day, what I feel like is that I had a complex psychological profile. And for some reason, for whatever reason, none of this was important to the people that assessed me, enough that I didn't learn that I had autism or ADHD until 7 years after I was on testosterone, and until I had already permanently lowered my voice, had already gotten rid of my breasts, etc. And I think about all of the people. I have a lot of trans friends, and a lot of them also are young adults. A lot of them are young women, and they all have as well psychological profiles that are very complex. And for me personally, it's hard to believe that they were essentially born transgender or born in the wrong body than to believe that they have similar things happening to them than I do. That's basically where I'm going to stop. And that's my story.
Thank you, Michelle. That was fascinating. It's a shocking story, and you say it so well. And I really think that anybody who works in mental health needs to stop and pause when they hear that story and realize, hang on a second, do we need to kind of let this be known